So Bennett, entrepreneurship news is not exactly what you'd expect. This morning, I was searching for entrepreneurship articles on Google News, and I thought it would be like all stories of founders launching their company, but instead it was a bunch of different articles. I've emailed you kind of the headlines, so let's talk through some of those.
Yeah.
The first one is from, and we're recording this July 19th, so this is just what's news today. The first one comes from sidepost.org. The headline is Researchers Connect Entrepreneurship to Cognitive Flexibility and Brain Structure. And the article cites a couple different studies. One was kind of a survey thing. One was actually MRIs. But they were saying that the key finding about entrepreneurship is that it correlates with cognitive flexibility, which they define as the ability to adapt, switch between different concepts, and change strategies. So first, what's your quick take? Like, is that accurate, do you think?
Yeah, I think intuitively that makes sense, right? Like if you were to ask any person kind of on the street, like, do you think entrepreneurs are cognitively more flexible than just your average person? Yes, right. So this is kind of a confirmation of what I think most people would already assume. But what I thought was really interesting was that it wasn't just the survey. It was actually like more, what was it, white matter in certain portions of the brain associated with cognitive flexibility. So it's more than just, anybody can be an entrepreneur. Like there are certain people who are likely going to be predisposed to being entrepreneurs. And specifically, they were targeting, what did they call them? Not serial, but like multiple entrepreneurs, or I can't remember how they phrased it, but people who had launched 3 or more companies either in sequence or at the same time. And so just strategically to do that, you have to be able to juggle not just multiple roles within a company, but multiple companies at the same time. So flexibility, obviously is going to be huge there.
Okay, so let's assume that they're right and flexibility is key. Definitely, we know a lot of entrepreneurs. I would say this is a trait that virtually all of them have in common. They're very flexible. You don't have a lot of like rigid, uptight, traditional people entering entrepreneurship. It needs to be more open-ended. So, okay, so let's assume that they're right, but then it's a nature-nurture question. Is it like you're implying that maybe there's a certain type of person better suited to entrepreneurship? Probably true, but is this something people can learn?
I wouldn't assume that you could learn it, right? But I think that you might not, like, how would you phrase that? Certain people are going to find it easier, right, to juggle multiple things, right? So it might be a personality thing where even though you might be able to learn it, it's just not something that's ever interesting to you, or that stress or the negative emotions associated with trying to become that individual are just so great that you abandon that. So I think anybody who was determined could come up with those skills, but it might take a lot more effort, right? You might have to remind yourself, hey, I can't care about everything today because I can only get so much done, right? And I've got 3 different projects or 3 different companies with different problems. I need to pick the most important things, focus on those, and the rest has to be ignored, right? I think that's one interesting thing with entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs that I've seen, is that they're willing to let certain fires burn, right? That just drives some people crazy. But like I've literally seen successful entrepreneurs where they're like, all right, here's 3 problems. All of them are terrible. This one's going to continue to be a problem, and I'm going to focus on these other 2. And I think anybody can learn that, but being predisposed to that is definitely going to help.
Yeah, totally agree. The study said that there could be, I believe it said there could be exercises you could do that would increase the brain matter in that area or make it more flexible. So they were kind of assuming that you could change. But yeah, I agree with that. So you had mentioned earlier that if you ask people on the street, is flexibility important for entrepreneurship? Probably everyone would say yes. But what if you didn't spin the ball like that? What if you just said, what is an important trait for entrepreneurship? Would a typical person come up with flexibility as the key?
I would think so, right? I don't know that it would be the number one answer, but I would assume it would be pretty high on the list. Yeah.
Yeah, I think most people would say that not being risk averse, like being a risk taker, which is the article defines as kind of part of flexibility. But the idea of task switching and being able to think in different ways about a problem, I'm not sure people would come up with that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it would end up there, but it might be phrased differently, right? Like they might say, well, to be an entrepreneur, you have to embrace, a chaotic atmosphere. Inherently, that's flexibility, right? So I think it might be phrased differently, or it might be kind of in the zeitgeist, different terms might be used, but the core concept, I think, would be there. And one thing that I will say about the study that was unclear was whether or not these individuals had increased their flexibility over time, right? That's why they had more white matter, or that they were inherently born with more, right? And so that was unclear, right? Because I was assuming that they just had more to begin with, but that wasn't really the conclusion of the study, right? They could have, through trial and error, developed this skill over time. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and lots of questions. And it's not clear that being flexible, like to your point, if you have certain personalities, you're more likely to do certain things. So definitely people who are not risk averse, who are flexible, are more likely to be entrepreneurs. But that doesn't mean that that's the key to being a good entrepreneur. Like, what if you measure the results of that trait versus, say, financial success of the company? It could
Right.
be that rigid people are less likely to go into it, but when they're there, they do a much better job. I doubt that's true, but we just
Well,
don't
but
know.
they didn't
So,
look at the success of the companies, right? Like if you
right,
start your companies, then you were kind of the target of this study, but it didn't say 3 successful companies, right? Like you could have
right.
started, you failed 3 companies, and you just jump around all the time. You're super flexible, but you never actually stick through and take anything to completion. So I think it's still
Yeah.
super open-ended, but definitely an interesting article.
Yeah. So let's go to the next one. Great. This is from UConn.edu. So this is the student newspaper at University of Connecticut. The title is Technology, Entrepreneurship, Waste Not, Want Not. And it's talking about a couple of students, their brothers, who I believe they're from Pakistan. And they're saying that in their country, a lot of people have diseases or die because of exposure to untreated water. And so they've developed a technology for purifying water. I'm not sure the exact details of the technology, but there are a few things I like about this article. One is a university paper highlighting technologies. You know, I'm sure it's easy to find articles about sports. We all like sports, but for a university, for students, like tech commercialization is way more relevant, way more germane. So like they're doing that. And then just the idea of students coming from someplace where they understand a problem well, and then they're working on a solution and the idea is to deploy it is great. At BYU, we have a number of humanitarian technologies that we're trying to get out there similar to this. What struck you about the article?
Well, I think the thing that jumped out to me was maybe a little bit different than what's jumping out at you was just kind of the timelines of some of these things, that it takes a long time for technologies to get introduced and successfully implemented into industry. Because reading through the article, it sounds like they've been working on this for a long time and they still have a long ways to go before it's, fully scaled up. But I think I wish there were more stories like this where people could understand some of those timelines, because it's easy to look at technologies and successful companies and say, oh, they were an overnight success, right? But that overnight success took 15, 20 years of dedicated work behind the scenes and multiple people and multiple agencies, right? And, stars kind of had to align a little bit. So I'd love to see more stories like this that highlight kind of the pain and struggle that goes into getting something like this, a good technology into industry and implemented successfully. So that's
Yeah.
kind of what stood out to me.
Yeah, especially like a capital intensive business, which is what this will
Yes.
be. And
Yeah.
because they're creating equipment, like heavy equipment. It's not a software startup. And even a software startup, though, Ryan Smith, when he talks about Qualtrics, talks about, I don't know how long it took them, but like 12 years or something to get traction. And he talks about all the work when no one even knew what they were doing. And so with the university technology, yeah, most of our companies will exit in the 5 to 10 year range.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't account for the 10 to 15 years of research that might have gone in before we got into the company.
Yes.
So the technology from start to finish, even a software technology from BYU, if you look at it really fairly, it might be a 20-year project. It's a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. So it was fun to see that highlighted, right? And they're still pretty early in the process. So it would be fun if they did a follow-up article, 3 or 4 years from now and kind of, hey, here's where they're at now. Here's how they progress. They're starting to scale, all those types of things. But fun to see.
Yeah. Also good for students. Like if you're at a university, why not work on something and launch a company, try to get it out in the world? Either you'll succeed or you won't, but it seems pretty worth doing. So
yeah, and the experience is going to be invaluable either way, right? Failing at a startup doesn't necessarily mean you're a failure. It just means you learn some things and you can roll that into the next one.
yeah, it's way more real world. So, okay. So the next article comes from entrepreneur.com. Obviously all their articles about entrepreneurship, but this one is titled, "This One Talent is the Greatest Skill You Can Develop for Entrepreneurship," says Professor Scott Galloway. I've seen Scott Galloway on YouTube a bit. He talks about entrepreneurship a lot, and that's a great clickbait headline. So how could I not read that? So what is the one greatest skill? And any guesses? I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Galloway, but what's the greatest skill?
I read the article just a little bit ago, but I can't remember what exactly he dialed in on as the one greatest skill.
He said storytelling. It's like, you do see a lot, like on my First Million podcast and places, they'll talk about storytelling a lot. And that's, that's important. The one greatest skill, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Maybe not. I don't know. I think it depends on what your purpose is. Elon Musk is a great storyteller, right? And he can paint these pictures of where he wants to go with the technologies. And he's super optimistic in the timelines of, when things are going to happen. And I don't know that there's a better fundraiser on the planet than Elon Musk, right? His ability to generate capital for these stories that he's creating is tremendous. And so is it the number one skill? I probably would say no, but is it a skill that you need to learn, especially if you have a technical background, right? If you come from engineering or, physics or some sort of technical, software development, and you don't know how to package up what you're doing into a story that people can relate to or access or understand, you are going to have an incredibly hard time gaining any kind of traction with what you're doing. So I think it's definitely an invaluable skill. Number one, maybe not, but definitely going to be up there.
Yeah, no, it is important. And now that I think about it, like we do spend a lot of time doing storytelling here, and we're not literally the entrepreneurs, but we're trying to get things in the hands of entrepreneurs. And we're trying to take abstract inventions like academic papers and make them more tangible. So one effort for that is our sell sheets, where we're creating these graphics, with text that are meant to tell a story, like explain a technology really easily. Yep. And so that is storytelling. Obviously, any LinkedIn post, email, whatever else. So yeah, it's definitely an important skill. If you want to learn it, what would you recommend?
I would say pitch your idea to somebody and then see if they can tell you what you just told them simply, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is if you tell somebody your idea and then you ask them to explain it back to you and they have no idea what you were talking about, right? You didn't incorporate enough of a story for them to remember the entire idea, right? And so then you need to take a step back, kind of rethink, okay, am I getting too technical? What can I focus on? How can I build this in a way that they can remember everything that I'm telling them about, right? Practice your elevator pitch, that 5-minute pitch of what is my idea? What am I trying to do? How is this going to change the world? And why should you care about what I'm doing, right? Everybody gets really self-absorbed with their lives. If you can build your pitch in a way that they can hold on to it and see value in it, I think that would be a great place to kind of start with your storytelling. And I think we do a lot of this with our podcast as well. Whenever we're doing a product-focused podcast, we do some prototyping here at the BYU Tech Transfer, and all of that is just to try to help people grasp some of these really hard technical concepts, right? So the last podcast that we did, we had 3 patents that we were reviewing, and we had prototyped a very simple use of one of the patents, but it's something that everybody can hold on to. They can see it. They can understand conceptually what it is. They can apply it in their own lives. Okay, I understand where they're coming from, and then use that as a jumping off point into some of the more technical aspects and kind of the open-endedness of how that technology can be applied. So I think, like you said, we do a lot of it here, and I think we're continuing to improve in our efforts to tell these stories in a way that more people can understand and catch the vision of what we're doing with the technology.
Yeah, and I'm actually really interested in storytelling, specifically in business. There are some books about being a storyteller in business, improving your skills there. There are many books about story structure. I've found those interesting. And I had, for one of our technologies, I was speaking with the guy who created the leading screenwriting software for Hollywood. And we're talking about our technology, which analyzes story structure, it's narrative analysis. Anyway, he was super interesting, and we talked about different theories of what story is. So that's kind of fun. But in practice, sometimes I fail pretty badly. The one place where, so we had Andrew Krause on the podcast a couple months ago, and he was great. And afterwards I said, man, you were so pithy. You explained complicated things so well. And he said, yeah, because I've been doing this for 25 years. I've explained these things thousands of times. And so maybe that's what it takes. But one thing I've said thousands of times, and I still don't do well, is explaining what I do at Tech Transfer. Like I'll meet an old friend or something, and what I tell them is, I'll say, well, so I'm director of Tech Transfer at BYU. So if a university professor creates an invention in the lab, we'll get it patented by attorneys, and then we license it to an outside business or launch a startup company. To me, that seems pretty simple, but often people don't know what I'm talking about. But what's wrong with that?
No, I have the same struggle, right? So I've been here for about a year, and telling everybody, what I do here at BYU. We commercialize the technology or the research that's developed at the university. I think sometimes it's easy to get bogged down in your specific technical jargon, right? So even things like license the technology, right? Most people, I don't know what that is, right? Like, at least not at a level that I can understand what you're telling me, right? Even things like commercialize the technology. Well, what do you mean commercialize?
Right.
So I think it just takes time and to your point earlier, right? Like if you do it over 20 years and you're constantly refining that pitch, you end up in a place where it's very succinct, very accessible to everyone, and they understand what you're doing, right? But we do have kind of a niche industry here. And so sometimes I feel your pain where it's hard to phrase it in an exact way that everybody understands exactly what it is that we do here at the Tech Transfer.
It's so true. What's a good everyday equivalent for licensing? If I didn't want to say licensing, I said, we moved the technology to an outside company, or, what would you say?
Yeah, I tend to lean into like, we try to find a company who's interested in picking up the technology, right? And so that's maybe a little less technical, and maybe something that they understand a little bit better. And that seems to help a little bit, right? Even though it's less technical than I want to explain it still helps them understand what it is that we're doing with the tech.
Okay. I'll try to do that. So storytelling, important. I don't know if Scott Galloway's right about being the most important thing, but there's definitely a case to be made.
Yeah.
So let's see. So the next one is from entrepreneur.com. And this is from an entrepreneur named Rogers Healy. It looks like he might be more of a venture capitalist guy. I don't know anything about him, but the title is Why I Get a Coffee with Someone New at 8 a.m. every single day. And so basically he's talking about the importance of meeting new people every day. For him, that's 8 a.m. coffee. For a lot of people, that would be lunch. There's that book, Never Eat Lunch Alone. People have these systems for meeting new people every day. So what do you think about that?
I really like that one. I just think for myself personally, networking is not one of my favorite things to do. It's something I have to force myself to do as regularly as I can. But I loved his insight when, like, he seemed really genuine, and he was talking about connecting people even when there's not an interest for yourself, right? So like somebody's telling you about something that they're trying to do, and you're like, oh, you're trying to do button manufacturing. Let me introduce you to so-and-so who owns a button manufacturing facility. They can hook you up and help you with it, right? He doesn't personally get anything out of that interaction. But in my own life, I've seen as I try to do that, right, and kind of play matchmaker a little bit and make some of those introductions, it almost always comes back and helps me in the long term, right? Where they'll then reach out to me and say, hey, here's so-and-so who's maybe a potential prototyping client or might be interested in some technology at BYU or whatever it might be. So I think building your network is incredibly important. Whatever mechanism you use, right? If you want to go have coffee with people, not maybe a great strategy here at BYU, but that's something you can do. Go to lunch with people, just make time to go to networking events. They can be super awkward, right? Put on your name tag, go introduce yourself to 20 people. But it truly is important if you want to be an entrepreneur who can be effective in whatever, industry that you're in. Because if you don't know enough of the right people, then everything is just, exponentially harder to do over time.
Yeah. In our interview with David Williams, who's a local entrepreneur, VC type, he said, moving from Silicon Valley, like meeting for coffee isn't really a thing here. For him, it's mountain biking. He said, trust me, the entrepreneurs around here go mountain biking. So that's maybe something to do. But for me, I like networking more than I've ever liked it before. Like early in my career, I really, really hated it. And one time I was talking with someone who explained to me, he's like, no one enjoys like the first introduction, like saying who I am, like my name and my title and stuff like that. But the reason you do it and enjoy it is because every person is a huge opportunity. Like there's something interesting about this person. You just got to find it out. And maybe you can do something together, or maybe it's like you say, maybe you're just helping them out some way. I always think of like microcredit, 15 or 20 years ago, that was very trendy. BYU, the church have been involved in microcredit. And so you'll have someone in some third world country where they can launch a business if they only had $25 or something, like some small amount. Like, it's so tragic. They don't have that little resource. Let's give that to them and let them create something. And then they can pay it back or not, whatever. Payback rates on those are really high. But this is the same sort of thing, introducing people. It's like, oh, you're not succeeding just because you don't know that person. Let me make an introduction there. And we had one of our student entrepreneurs, one of our licensees, was talking to me the other day and said, look, I'm trying to network for my business. I just don't know how to do it. Yeah. We've just been around here long enough. They said, oh, well, you should totally talk to this person and that person and that person. So student entrepreneurs who are listening to this, why don't you come pick our brains and have us introduce you to some people? We would do that. Probably any business person would do that. But then we all just need to work on connecting people a little bit better, right?
Yeah. Well, and when you're starting out as an entrepreneur, like sometimes it feels like such a big ask, right? To go to somebody and say, hey, could you introduce me to so-and-so, right? I think they could really help me with my business. I don't know why, but it gets built up in your brain as like, oh man, I'm asking them for the world. When the reality is it's like, oh, sure, great. Let me send an email or send a text. Great. Yeah, you have the number, talk to them, right? Like that is the extent of it. It takes 2-3 minutes and you're done. and everybody feels good about that process, right? I was listening to Ben Shapiro the other day, and he said people love when you ask them for favors. He's like, it's this weird psychological
True.
thing, but if you go to somebody and you ask them for a favor, and just genuinely because you need the help, right? 90% of the time, right? You got that 10% are going to tell you to go, kick the brakes and get here, right? But most of the time, people love helping other people out if they have the time and if they're able to actually provide that help. So go ask for some favors, right? Go ask for people to introduce you, go introduce yourself to others, right? All those types of things. But it's a supernatural thing to do, and you will find people to be more helpful than you ever thought they would be if you just go and ask.
Yeah, asking for someone for a little favor is a good strategy to connect with them as well. There's a term for this, that Benjamin Franklin had some enemy that he had been arguing with in public. And so he asked the guy to loan him a book, which he did. And so that he saw that as just like helping create a connection there. It's our brains work both directions. You think, if I'm a kind person, I help people. But then if you get in a situation where you help someone, you work backwards. Oh, I must be kind to them. Like I must have a relationship with them or something. So it's a weird thing.
First, at least a little bit because I helped him out a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And then to your point, right? You can genuinely find something interesting about them that you can like. I think that's super reasonable.
Yeah, I genuinely like connecting people with other people. So students should take advantage of that. And on my end, if someone says, "Hey, can you introduce me to so and so?" I think, well, I haven't contacted them for a while anyway. Like this is something I'm talking about, so that could be good. There's definitely a wrong way to do it. You don't want to be super selfish and greedy. Like come in and say, "Okay, help me do my business, and here are 20 things." But most people aren't like that. Like most people are more reasonable, right?
Yeah, and I think if you kind of back to that first article, if you have that flexibility of mindset, like you go into a lot of these things, at least I do, with very, very low expectations, right? Even if I ask for an introduction to somebody from somebody else, I never go into it expecting like, okay, this is going to make or break my business, right? It's more like, okay, this is one more data point, one more person who now knows what I'm doing, who may or may not be interested in helping. And at the very least, I've expanded my network. So lower your expectations, increase your frequency. And over time, that's the other thing, right? It does take time, but over time, you should see results and have a really robust network that'll allow you to be flexible as an entrepreneur and successful in whatever it is that you decide to work.
Yeah, Mike Handren, the director of the Rollins Center, when we had him on here, I was asking, what do you know about entrepreneurs, student entrepreneurs that other people don't? And he said, well, I know that they're action oriented. I think that was his answer. And so as a student entrepreneur, one action you can take is to go around meeting the right people. If you don't know what to do, then go ask someone, what do I do? So, okay. So, I like that article quite a lot. So here's another one. I think it's our last one. It's killerstartups.com is the site. I don't really know them. I assume they have lots of articles about startups. And this one is called Transitioning to Entrepreneurship, Attracting the Majority of Workforce. So I saw that and I thought, really? So the majority of the workforce is becoming entrepreneurs? That can't be true. And it's not true, but it's a good title. I clicked on the article. What it says was there was a survey and 60% of the American workforce said that they are intrigued by entrepreneurial freedom and potential financial rewards. That sounds that sounds low to me. Only 60% find entrepreneurship intriguing, at least, but I don't know. It's a little vague thing. But it raises the issue for me. How has the culture changed regarding entrepreneurship? Do you think entrepreneurship is more popular now than it was in the past?
I would say so. I would say it's probably as popular now as it ever has been in the past, right? I think some of the, richest people in the world, the most visible companies and individuals who lead, those companies, all come from, maybe not all, but mostly, maybe not mostly, a lot of them come from entrepreneurial backgrounds, right? Incredibly popular. And so I think it's definitely more in kind of the public space. People are talking about it. Accessibility to these individuals, right? They're jumping on podcasts, they're talking about their stories, they're talking about how they got started. If you're interested in it, you can go down a rabbit hole on YouTube, right? And listen to 50, 60, 70, 100 different founders who all will talk through their stories, start to finish. Here's where I started. I had $100 and an idea, and here's where I ended, $1 billion. And so I think being able to see that success and listen to those individuals in a more intimate way than we ever have been before is probably increasing people's just awareness and interest in entrepreneurship in general.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think when I was a kid, so in the 80s, if you asked, okay, who's a business person, everyone would immediately think the CEO of General Motors or something. Right. You think of some really established person, and you might as well be talking about the King of England. It's this unapproachable person. Well, that's fascinating that there are awesome people out there. I'll never be one of them. But now when you talk about business, everyone's going to come up with, Elon Musk or maybe Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or someone like that. All of these people are entrepreneurs who mostly started with nothing. Some of them had some head starts. And so it makes it way more accessible, it's more interesting to people. And sometimes people complain about this or that, like it's hard to get funding for my startup right now. But I think the weight of opinion is that this is the best time ever to start a startup company. And so I think that affects people's thinking on it too, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it also is a path to success that people can envision, right? Like you were talking about 50 years ago, the CEO of General Motors or something. Like people try to think through that and they're like, well, I don't work at a big company, right? I'm not an executive. I'm not in, management track. Like I don't know anybody at the top who could help me in my career get to that point. Like trying to picture that path to success is just like, it's way too out there for most people. But when you hear some of these other founder stories and they're like, yeah, I started my garage. It's like, well, I have a garage, right? And they're like, I just started with a great idea. And it's like, well, I think I have a great idea. So it's easy to kind of implant yourself into their path and see yourself walking through that. So I think that's another reason that people are thinking about it for sure.
Yeah. And also, I think way more of us know people who have succeeded as entrepreneurs probably. Yeah. So I saw one on LinkedIn the other day. I didn't realize. So we have BYU students who come through here looking for technologies to license. And we had a student a decade ago who he and another guy I know well were licensing one of our technologies, and they tried and they just didn't quite get funding. It didn't quite work out. So they returned the technology. And what would be sad for me, and I know lots of people do it, it's fine, but what would be sad for me is if he went and worked like a very traditional job and was after that and was just frustrated, he didn't become an entrepreneur. But he didn't do that. He kept trying. There were a couple more misses, I think. I saw on LinkedIn, he just sold his company for $1 billion. So good job. Like maybe we'll have him on the podcast sometime. But he's a completely ordinary, normal person who I know. And he just worked away at this thing and eventually found something that really worked and scaled up for him. So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the really cool things about entrepreneurship is that as long as you don't give up, there's always that possibility that you're going to hit it big, right? And even like a base hit sometimes, right, in entrepreneurship is still enough to set you up with a really comfortable lifestyle, right? And opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise. So even if it's a side hustle, even if it's, something that you can't devote yourself to full time, I'm excited that more and more people are thinking about it and are exploring how they can start their own ventures and make it part of their life. And hopefully, have that big $1 billion payout, which is great.
Oh, one more factor I think is just some ideas that circulate a little better now. So in 2006 or so, Tim Ferriss published the 4-Hour Workday. Mm-hmm. That definitely influenced me and changed my thinking. That I was an employee at a law firm at the time. And I thought, oh, well, yeah, maybe this isn't financially optimal. And then there's Rich Dad, Poor Dad in those books talking about just comparing, look, if you're an employee, here's how that looks. But if you're an entrepreneur, here's how that looks. I think people are more aware of the trade-offs they make when choosing a career versus launching something. So that could be one more factor.
Yeah. And financial literacy, right? Just your availability to understand how you can structure your finances in different modes of income and passive income and investments. And I'm sure that was accessible, in the past over time, but it has never been more accessible than it is now, right? And so I think that contributes.
And I'll tell you what, like 15 years ago, if you were researching venture capital, there were almost no books out there. It was so hard to learn anything about it. But now there are like innumerable books, like tons of venture capital podcasts. You can learn about it really easily. And you can get lists of VCs and connect with people easier than ever too. So,
yep.
But okay. Well, hey, thanks, Ben. This has been interesting to talk about. Lots of great stories out there. We hit a few of them, and we will be back next week with another episode.
Sounds good.